Yes, I think that the strategic plan of the tri-faith.
Welcome everyone to a watershed moment for Muslims, Christians, and Jews in 1920s Persia. We are very excited at the Tri-Faith Initiative to have Sue Stein as a very active participant in so many of our programs, but also as someone who has her own expertise in a very interesting topic of the man named Robert Imbrie. Is that right? Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sue, for being here with us and sharing your knowledge with us. We're very lucky that you are so engaged and literally wrote the book on such an interesting and relevant topic for our organization and for the times that we're living in. So I am Allie Zimmermoss. I'm the Education and Program Associate at the Tri-Faith Initiative. Just so that everybody's prepared, you can put your questions into the chat box at any point during the program. We are going to save question and answer for the very end of the program. At that point, we'll go through the questions that we have in the chat, as well as allowing people to ask questions right then and there as we're in that section of the program today. So without further ado, Sue, would you like to introduce yourself and get us started?
All right. I think I'm going to try my presentation, bringing that up now, Allie. So let's see if that works, okay? And yeah, not sure about that. Did you get to see that, Allie? Did that come up as it should or not?
Nothing's come up yet.
Okay, I'm going to go in another way then.
All right.
Let me see. Okay, let me see if this will come up. And then I think I need to go in and push a screen. And then
looks perfect.
Does that look all right? Okay, thank you. And Allie, I'm going to change the gallery here so I can see what I need to see.
Perfect, whatever you need.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Tri-Faith for this opportunity to have me talk about a too often neglected period in history, the interwar years. It's an honor to be included in the Tri-Faith events. Tri-Faith is unique, and it's an honor to be included in this project. It has a purpose-built campus with a church and a synagogue and mosque and a commitment to interfaith dialogue. So I hope my talk contributes to furthering this important mission. Yeah. In July 2020, the University of Nebraska Press published my book on distant service, which is the first biography of the U.S. Vice Consul Robert Imbrie. His murder in Tehran on July 18th, which is the anniversary is 5 days away, propelled the Pahlavi dynasty to power. It lasted with a brief interregnum until 1979. And since then, Iran has been a Shia Muslim theocracy, the only one in the world. Oops, I'm sorry. Let's, I'm going to have to go back a little bit here. I think I hit something wrong.
Happens to the best of us.
despite practice, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. Are we sharing now? All right.
Looks great.
Okay. Well, as I was saying, I wrote the first biography of the U.S. Vice Consul, Robert Imbrie, and his murder in Tehran propelled the Pahlavi dynasty to power. And it's, I think you will see maybe why we are where we are today with the current situation. I'm going to give a few words about Imbrie, who he was, just a little bit. He was born in 1883. He was a Yale Law School graduate, a volunteer ambulance driver in World War I. You can see him here in his uniform. When the war broke out in Europe, he volunteered as an ambulance driver. He was one of the longest serving ambulance drivers, volunteers in the war. He served 17 months at the front in France and the Balkans. And then when we came into the war, the U.S., he was past draft age. So he joined the State Department to do consular work. And he was sent to Russia and Finland during the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. And the middle piece here is one of his charts with his information gathering network when he was in Finland trying to figure out what was going on in Russia. This cartoon, which was in the New York Times, shows him confronting the head of the Cheka, which was the secret police, and demanding the release of Americans who were being held in Peter and Paul fortress. He was next posted to Turkey after the Russian White Army, which was fighting the Bolsheviks, collapsed. He was in Turkey during its War of Independence. And while he was there, he met Catherine Gillespie, who was an aid worker from Massachusetts. She was with Near East Relief. She was working with Armenian and Greek orphans. And just as an aside, one of her tasks was moving 30,000 orphans to an empty Russian barracks in Alexandropol. They married in Constantinople in December of 1922, and their next posting was to Persia. To the left is a picture of Imbrie on horseback during one of his information gathering trips to Anatolia through Turkey. I would like to start with a few facts about Iran. Its name in the 1920s was Persia, so I'll be flip-flopping back and forth. It's large. It is 6 times the size of Germany, with roughly the same population, about 80 million. It has a history of almost 3,000 years. It's one of the few nations that was not colonized by European powers. The last time Iran participated in a war was in the 1850s. And the last time it invaded another nation was 1816. At the time of the 1979 revolution, the largest contingent of international students in the US were Iranian, over 56,000. We're going to look today at 3 areas of conflict in Persia. We're obviously going to concentrate on the religious, but they intertwined, the commercial, the political, the religious. There was a great deal of unrest in the Middle East or the Near East, depending on what terminology you're using at the time. And they were interested, especially in oil, of course, but there were other areas of interest, like sturgeon fish, and which produces a very expensive caviar. In the next slide, I'm going to show you the holdings that were in the area and that threatened Persia. And what I'd like you to look at are the pink areas and the purple areas, because it will give you an idea of how vulnerable Persia felt. And Russia is purple, Britain is pink. And you can see off to the side a kind of a deep red, and that's Turkey, where Imbrie had been before. So let's look at that now. So what happens is in the 20s that Persia is obviously has this fabulous strategic location, and Russia would love to be able to connect to the Persian Gulf, or better yet, to the Indian Empire. And of course, the Indian Empire, which is part of Britain at the time, the British also control this area to the left of the map. They've taken over what we call Iraq today. And Persia knows these two countries would very much like to control Persia. And Persia recognizes that Iraq has been made into a mandate, and they do not want to be controlled by the British. As soon as Imbrie gets there, he sends a report, and he says that the climate of Persia is said to be changing. That's a vast understatement. Always favorable to intrigue, here two great practitioners of the gentle art, the British and the Bolshevik, find venal fields for the playing of their games. That the American enterprises are serving as the football does not lessen our interest. And I think this is a wonderful slide from a little bit before the 20s, but the British lion is on the left holding the tail of this cat, and the Russian bear is on the right petting the head. And of course, it's a Persian cat. And the Persian cat is saying, I don't remember being consulted about this. So with this background, I'm now going to turn to the religious situation by highlighting individuals who were part of the story. And I'm going to be focusing on different religions. And so I'm going to start with the Jewish religion and with Rabbi Joseph Kornfeld. Rabbi Kornfeld was posted to Persia to try to improve Iranian Jewish lives. The Jews lived under many restrictions. They were unable to take part in the political life of the country or take a leading role in the economic life of the country. The oath of a Jew in court was not accepted. If a Jew converted to Islam, he became the sole inheritor of the family property, leaving the rest destitute if he so willed. In some towns, they were forbidden to have shops and bazaars. They were levied arbitrary taxes. Somebody who murders a Jew could purchase immunity. They had to wear a fez rather than the cooler turban, and they were wearing badges identifying them as Jews as late as 1897. So these restrictions were in place because of the concept in Shia Islam of uncleanness. If a person were not Shia, he or she were unclean. So if it was raining, a Jew could not go outside because the rainwater falling on him could then pollute water that could wash on to a Muslim. There were pogroms and massacres in 1865, 1888, and 1889. And there's a 440-page collection of reports from the U.S. Foreign Service officers and others recounting attacks in the Middle East on Jews between 1840 and 1838. They also suffered from food insecurity. In 1918, about 25% of the Jews in Persia were suffering starvation. Before and after World War I, the US and Europe appealed for better conditions for Persian Jews. And when the Shah visited Europe, prominent Jews, including the Rothschilds, appealed for help at every city he visited. And I believe that even though it's nowhere in the document, it seems pretty obvious that Rabbi Kornfeld was part of the effort to better condition for Persian Jews with this appointment. He was able to prevent a pogrom in 1922. I think he was also appointed because of the publication of the Protocol of the Elders, a fraudulent anti-Semitic document putting forth a conspiracy by Jews to take over the world. Henry Ford published it as a series in the Dearborn Independent. He was anti-Semitic. And it was lambasted by many prominent Americans, including past presidents and President Warren Harding. However, even though it was debunked, it was widely read. So I think that's another reason that a rabbi was given this appointment. I'm including the Baha'is, and I think you'll see why in a minute. In 1820, Sayyid Ali Muhammad founded a reform movement proclaiming himself as Bab, or Gate to God. So this was seen as a threat to Islam and this reform movement for Islam. And he was arrested and executed in Tabriz in 1850. Tabriz was a very sophisticated commercial city to the north. So it was often the site of revolutionary work, or in this case, a reform movement. Under the Bab's disciples, Baha'u'llah and his son Abdul Baha, Baha'ism became a worldwide religion noted for tolerance and peaceful recognition of other faiths. In its opposition to Islamic practices such as the pilgrimage to Mecca or the call to prayer, the concept of unbelievers being unclean, it threatened Shia Islam. What happened though with Baha'ism is that when the Baha went to Europe and to the US, there was war on the horizon, and his message of a brotherhood of mankind, of universal peace, resonated with people. And so there were a good number of converts. In our story today, I want to focus on Dr. Susan Moody. She was one of the Americans that was converted to Baha'ism, and she had studied late in life to be a medical doctor. She went to Persia in 1909 to run a clinic for women and attend women in the hospital. She founded a school for women. And in the summer of 1924, there were a number of attacks on Baha'is. And she alerted Robert Imbrie that she had been marked by a Black Hand Committee to be killed, and that her assassin would be given 350 tomans upon her death. Imbrie was able to get protection for her, and she later said that without Imbrie, there would have been a holocaust of bloodshed and looting. 2 nights earlier, a Baha'i physician had had to escape a mob by running across rooftops in Tehran after a mob broke into his house. He was, even though she had been in the country for a long time, she was so shaken by the events of that summer, she returned to America. She did come back to Tehran to continue her medical practice. She was there then from 1928 till her death in 1934. It seems in looking through archival material that the Bahas were targeted by government agents to distract crowds from political and economic controversies. When Imbrie himself was attacked, an instigator of the mob yelled that he was a Baha'i. They were seen as easy targets. The next group I want to look at are Christians, and I'm going to focus particularly on the American Presbyterian missionaries because they're the ones I've researched. They began arriving in Persia in the 1830s. They were not sent to convert Muslims. That was forbidden. They were there to provide healthcare, establish Western-style schools, and evangelize among the Armenian, Chaldean, and Assyrian Christians, which in a kind of arrogance, I think, they felt that those modes of Christianity needed to be brought into modern times. And it's interesting to me that the first person to run for help when Imbrie was attacked was a Chaldean Christian. Other Christian missionaries were present as well, among them Catholic. The Jesuits first arrived in the 16th century. There were Baptists, Anglicans, Russian Orthodox, and others. But the Presbyterian missionaries were very prominent, especially in the northern part of the country, around Tabriz. And what I'm picturing here are the Presbyterian missionaries, Dr. Harry and Francis Packard. They arrived in 1906 in northern Persia as medical missionaries. Interestingly, 2/3 of the Presbyterian missionaries were women. And most of the missionaries were well educated. The women who came in this time period had college degrees, and some of them had graduate degrees, such as medical degrees. Because we did not have official diplomatic missions in Persia until 1883, the Presbyterian missionaries served sometimes as unofficial U.S. diplomats. The Packards, even though most of their work was in northern Persia, were in Tehran the summer of 1924. They and the Imbries quickly formed a friendship. Packard treated Imbrie at the hospital after Imbrie was attacked, and the next day performed his autopsy. All of these minority religions were impacted by the political landscape of the time, as was the dominant religion, Islam. Here is depicted the last Qajar Shah with Reza Khan, who would overthrow the Qajar dynasty. Ahmad Shah was born in 1898, ascended to the throne when he was 11, and was formally crowned in 1914. To see how this dynasty ended, which spanned from 1789 to 1925, and how its demise impacted Islam, we need to look at the rise of Reza Khan. In May 1921, Reza Khan, a Cossack officer, led a small army into Tehran, supposedly to stabilize the weak Shah's government. And he was weak. He was a weak Shah, and it was a weak government. His father had fled the country, leaving him when he was 9 years old. And so he had very little expertise, and he was self-centered, maybe understandably so, having to take care of himself under those circumstances. Reza Khan, however, was not concerned about the Shah's government. He thought he could establish a republic like Turkey's. To do so, he had to work with the Majlis, and it was not as easy as he thought. One Majlis deputy was particularly formidable, Hassan Madaris. He was a moderate cleric, and he opposed Reza Khan's call for a republic because he feared a dictatorship. And I really think that he saw in Reza Khan that he was not going to settle for just being a president. I think he read Reza Khan very well. And so we see the opposition forcing Reza Khan to regroup after he's denied a bill that would establish a republic. Reza Khan goes on a religious pilgrimage, just consults with ayatollahs, and comes back and says, no, 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 we can't have a republic. We need to promote Islam. What he was really doing was focusing on overthrowing the Qijars, and he did that through intimidation and thuggery, conniving to see moderates did not have representation in the parliament, physically drive them out of the parliament. And so he eventually got his wish. The final blow to any opposition to Reza Khan occurred on July 18th, 1924, with the murder of U.S. Vice Consul Robert Imbrie. Reza Khan quickly declared martial law, put himself in charge of the government, and martial law was not lifted until 1926. This was a huge story throughout the world. And it was in the newspapers in China, London, Paris, California, New York, and it was in the Omaha World-Herald as well. So, which is why I brought that headline up. In October 1925, Reza Khan became Reza Shah, founder of the Pahlavi dynasty. In the following decades, he sidelined the clerics as impediments to progress, impediments to westernization and secularization, both of which gained ground. He championed ancient Persian history over Islam. The moderate cleric Modares was exiled and under house arrest, and he died mysteriously in 1936. Probably he was poisoned. Reza Khan greatly admired Mustafa Kemal, who was establishing a republic in Turkey, but the two men were vastly different in backgrounds, level of education, travel experiences, military experiences. And so the fate of the two countries were very different. One thing I think that really hampered Persia, besides having this man whose personality was so different, Persia was a confederation of tribes with little centralized power. Turkey had a history of centralized power. It also had a highly educated officer class and a well-developed military, an impressive army. And Reza Khan, who now is Reza Shah, did not have these. Mustafa Kemal had also traveled extensively in Europe. He was well educated, and but Reza Shah, the only trip he ever made outside the borders of Iran was to visit Mustafa Kemal in Turkey. So both men were at the pinnacle of their countries, but one difference is that where Mustafa Kemal developed a cult of personality, he's called Ataturk, or the father of modern Turkey. He was able to assure a transition of representative government. And they always say that is the key to see if a country is truly a democracy or a republic. Not the first president elected, but will there be a second? And so many times we have seen that there, as soon as the first president's term is up, that he extends it ad infinitum. So today, if you look at the State Department's website, it will give a presentation annually of conditions in different countries, including religion. And so I pulled these two sections from the most recent report. And it's interesting to compare the difference between the two countries. Reza Khan, Reza Shah admired Kemal, but was unable or unwilling to create a republic. So the two are very different. And even though today Turkey has been becoming more repressive in recent years, but you can see that this is a secular state and this is an Islamic republic. So according to the World Christian Database statistics, the Christians of various denominations in Iran today, about 500,000. They don't practice religion overtly. The Baha'is form the largest religious minority in Iran, but it's still very small, 300,000. There's 8 million Baha'is worldwide, but only 300,000 in Iran, and they are discriminated against. The Jewish population is also quite small. After the 1979 revolution, there was a movement, a huge diaspora. Some critics, researchers call it a brain drain. And there were about 100,000 to 150,000 Jews. Today, about 12 or 15,000, about 60 synagogues, and 6 of which are in Tehran, and about 150,000 Iranian Jews living in Israel. Today, there might be an announcement regarding the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, though some people object to the word deal because it sounds kind of underhanded. So it may come today or tomorrow. There is concern over the president-elect, Ibrahim Raisi, Iran's top judge, succeeding Rouhani, who's generally regarded as more moderate, and arranged for the JCPOA to be negotiated in the first place. I'd like to close this part of the presentation with a reference to chess. Abbas Amanat, in his book, In Iran, A Modern History, which starts in the 16th century, it's a new book, it's quite good, refers to a Persian poet's use of chess to describe the vulnerable institution of kingship and the role of advisors. The advisors are like the queen and yield great power, but a pawn can become a king. Although chess developed in India, the concept of checkmate is Persian, shamat. How that played out with this peasant becoming Shah of Iran, and how it will play out in today's Iran is to be seen. In 2009, there was a huge demonstration at the Azadi Tower in Tehran, protesting what was felt was a illegal election. And it was important, I think, that it was at the Azadi Tower, which commemorates the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire. Huge outpouring. Unfortunately, many of the people who were arrested were, movie directors, journalists, and so on, are either jailed or were banned or went into exile. There was a great deal of repression after this demonstration. So with that, I would like to take some questions if you have them.
Yeah, thank you for a fascinating presentation so far. We do have a couple questions already in the chat. So I'm just gonna give them to you in the order that they came in, because the first one should be a more simple one. Abdul wants to know when the name change occurred from Persia to Iran.
I want to say off the top of my head, 1933, but I can double check that. And what he was doing was going back, what Reza Shah was doing was going back to an ancient word that describes the people, because Iran really means Aryan, as in the Aryan people. And so he thought it was more collective. And that's something I didn't mention. The country, and I might have just alluded to it, but the country was so tribal. Iran was so tribal. When Reza Khan came to power, the very next thing he did was to go out and quell the tribes. And it's a tremendously diverse country. That was another big difference, I think, with Turkey. It didn't have quite the diversity, and certainly not the land spread that Persia had, that made it, I think, more difficult to turn into a republic at the time. So I hope that, I don't think that answers the question, but I'll try and find it really quickly.
Yeah, well, in the meantime, well, thank you for your attempted answer. That is some also fascinating background. But another question that came in was from Todd Peppers, who wants to know, what lessons could our modern State Department take from your book and in general, the story of Robert Imbrie?
Thank you. I did check. It's 1935, Abdul. Thank you for the question, Todd. I did speak to the U.S. State Department in January about this person that's on the plaque in the entrance to the building for giving his life in service to the country. I named the book On Distant Service. That's how in those days, the U.S. State Department referred to their people who were posted in other countries. But this word service is really important to me in looking at Imbrie's life. He did so much humanitarian work, especially with famine relief. But anyway, it's disturbing to look at the U.S. State Department at the time. Partly because there were so many amateurs who were in the diplomatic corps, and ambassadors, ministers, and so on. For those who were career people in the State Department, there was very little training, and there was poor communication. It was an extremely small staff. I mean, it was in the hundreds at the beginning of World War I. It's just amazing. And when I was going through the research, I felt like I was working with a repertoire theater, where you have maybe 10 actors and they keep reappearing in different plays. And these people reappear in different countries. And so it was very small. And when Imbrie, for example, was in St. Petersburg, he was the last U.S. observer in that city, trying to deal with American businessmen and famine and hospitals that Americans had been running and then had to leave and so on. So here's one man in a city the size of St. Petersburg. There was also anti-Semitism, and I think it's ironic that the head of the division that Persia was in at the time was headed up by Allen Dulles, who became the head of the CIA, or yes, he became the head of the CIA. He was fired after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he was in and out of the State Department for a long time. But here he is overseeing this effort in Persia. But he himself, if you look at his letters, was anti-Semitic. And after Imbrie's death, you can see that as well. I think Joseph Kornfeld had a very difficult time. in Persia. And I wish somebody was doing some research on him. I don't know if we have letters from him. We do have his record at the State Department, and people are not kind to him in that record. Todd, I don't know if that, Ali, do you think I answered Todd's question?
I think so. Todd, if you want to let us know, you can either in the chat or in a little bit. I think we might get a chance for people to ask questions out loud if they would like, since we're getting through some of the questions in the chat. But as we go through some of these things, I see that Abdul also had a really interesting comment, just engaging with some of the content and the things that were happening. Abdul, do you want to unmute yourself and share your comment?
Sure thing. Thank you. All right. My comment was the issue of cleanliness and labeling, people and religious groups as unclean and forcing Jews to wear identification badges is really bothersome, and it's un-Islamic. I mean, that I know you do great research and all that, but that doesn't jive with how we act. So I'm just, curious about that. So.
Yeah, Abdul, a lot of the research bothers me. And I thought when I was preparing this presentation that I don't want any of it to be hurtful or for people to take away stereotyping. It's one thing to say how people were behaving and what governments were doing and what individuals were doing. And it's another thing to say that this is the religion. For example, when the Christian missionaries were in the North, they were taking care of the Kurds and the Christians. There's one scene where Dr. Packard is riding on horseback, waving the American flag to try and save Christians, but not to save Muslims. And it's really disturbing. You want all of these people to be good-hearted and well-informed and not to have the prejudice of their day. But unfortunately, some are prejudiced. And also, going back to the beginning of my talk, economics plays a big factor in this. The Jews tended to be successful in the bazaars. They were very, very skilled in many areas, and they became an object of jealousy. So again, they were easy to attack. And you can say it was for religious reasons, but then you kind of dig under and you wonder, well, what was really going on in the bazaars, or wherever there was a tailor or a weaver or a dyer or an alcohol maker or a merchant. It was obvious to, as I think another point of this is that Persia was being exposed more to Western ways, and through trade. Trade was exploding in World War I and after. And the Jews had a long history of working through difficult trade issues. So again, it might have made their skills, their knowledge might have made them targets that had nothing really to do with the religion, but with the economics. What do you think, Abdul?
Yeah, because, for centuries, Jews and Muslims and Christians existed side by side in Muslim Spain, in the Ottoman Empire, and Jews have lived in Persia for God, at least 1,000 years or more. I mean, that was
2,500, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean,
So then what brings all of a
I
sudden,
find that, baffling. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, what brings these restrictions, these disciplines? And is part of it fear? That we are going to be run over if we don't form a unified picture to the world. And so I think that leads into it as well. Persia was just being stripped of its oil resources. And part of that was because of their dynasty. They had such weak leaders in the Qajar dynasty toward the end. And so they were extremely vulnerable. And they could have been taken over completely the way India was. And they didn't want that. So.
right. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Abdul. I'm glad you asked that because I have been thinking about that. So.
We also have a question from Mary Spurgeon, who asks, did Sunni Muslims have a role to play in this historical period?
Well, yes. Sunni Muslims were in Turkey, in Iraq. In other words, and in the Arab countries. And so that is, in a sense, a way that Persia gets isolated as well, because it is mostly Shia. And so it sees Sunni influence as dangerous to its mission. So it isn't as though the Sunni and the Shia said, well, let's get together on this and promote Islam together. There was a division in the interpretation. I guess, this is not my primary area at all, but I think of it in a way like the Reformation with the Catholics and the Protestants. They're both Christians, but they have different approaches. And I want to go back a minute too to Abdul. I think it's really important to remember that Islam is a religion of mercy when you're looking at history, and Christianity is supposed to be a religion of love. And when you look at history, there's a lot of evidence to the opposite. So it's important not to confuse history with the faith, I think. So, and I want to go back to Todd for just a minute. What can we do with the State Department? We need to have more native speakers for these countries, or at least people who are fluent in other languages like Farsi, or who know the culture. We need to see the importance of being on the ground and really understand a country. And I could see that in working the Imbrie case, how not knowing a language was such a detriment to those foreign officers. I wish we taught more foreign languages and more students were at least bilingual in the United States, maybe trilingual.
Thank you. Actually, Todd has another question. He wants to know about what is next for you in your research and your writing. What new topics of interest did this book maybe trigger for you?
Well, thank you for your interest. I fell upon this story, actually. I was researching an early radio news commentator. He was an isolationist before World War I, but he seems to have come from Azerbaijan. And so even though he was on the Philco radio hour in Philadelphia, and he was a very dapper looking British looking person, I ended up doing some research on Azerbaijan and to try and understand him a little bit, and then got diverted for the next 12 years with Robert Imbrie's story, because that's how I came across Robert Imbrie. I'm really intrigued now with these women missionaries that came. You know, when I read that 2/3 of these women, these Presbyterian Christian women, the 2/3 of the missionaries were women, I'm really intrigued by that. And I've been trying to find more information on them. Mrs. Packard brought her piano with her to Persia. She had 4 sons in Persia. And yet she also founded schools for nurses and helped in feeding people during wartime. And she was there during World War I. She was there during the pandemic of 1918, 1919. She was there during the revolution, the constitutional revolution. It strikes me that these are really remarkable women. And one theory is that they saw life in the United States as very limiting for them. They had education, they had wherewithal. Later on, after World War II, the missions are not so well endowed by benefactors, U.S. benefactors, and kind of fall on hard times. But at the time that Francis was there, these women didn't seem to want to just be housewives, as if that's just something, or just mothers. They wanted a freedom that they didn't think they would have in the US. And so they went to foreign countries where they could reinvent themselves. They were also housewives and mothers in Persia, but they were also nurses and doctors and teachers. So I think that's where I'm next going. Thank you, Todd.
That sounds fascinating. We'll look forward to having another event with you once you've written a book on that. So I also had a question, kind of backing up from where Todd's question went. Initially, when you were first hearing about discovering Robert Imbrie's story, what about it made it come alive to you that you decided that he needs his own book?
Oh, well, I guess a couple things. He has a wonderful personality. He's very funny. And there are some letters, and he really shows that humor. And I think sometimes he bothered the State Department because even some of his reports would be interjected with humor. He was a very caring person. He could relate to people who were on high levels of government. He could sit on the ground and talk to somebody in a bazaar. He had a degree from Yale. His very first job was with the Legal Aid Society. I mean, he could have done anything. He could have gone into corporate law or anything like that, but he immediately went to work with indigent sailors who had been shanghaied. There was a terrible problem in Maryland at the time for the oyster fishermen who were being shanghaied and taken on board ships as sailors. And so he was an adventurer too. He went to Africa with a man who thought he could teach, he thought he could learn to talk to the gorillas, kind of an early Dr. Dolittle. Imbrie didn't believe a word of it, of course, literally, but he was an adventurer, but he was very caring. And the fact that he was involved in the Russian Revolution, the Russian War for Independence, the Turkish War for Independence, or the Russian Civil War and the Turkish War for Independence, and survived all this, to me, just made him an amazing person that I wanted to learn more about.
Yeah, he sounds like quite the figure. It looks like we've got one last question with our last couple minutes here. or it looks like we might have a couple. So
Okay.
if people want to keep staying on, then they're more than welcome to.
Mhm.
Before we wrap up the hour, though, I did want to mention a plug for Tri-Faith Initiative is having a picnic on August 1st, and you are all welcome and encouraged to attend that. It's going to be very festival-like and very exciting. So be sure to check that out, as well as some of the topics that came up in Sue's presentation today. Also might come up in future sessions of Abraham's whiteboard. For example, in the coming months, there will be one session on the Baha'i faith, which you heard some references to that Susan mentioned, as well as always interesting topics led by Jeremy. So yeah, I think that's it for that. Sue, would you have a couple minutes for these last couple of
Sure.
questions?
Yes, be happy to.
Awesome. And the recording of this will be posted later. So if anybody has to get going, the end of their lunch hour, anything like that, it will be posted and you can visit it later on. So we've got a question from Mary Spurgeon asking, Sue, in your opinion, what might this experience, Robert Imbrie's experience as an ambulance driver in World War I, have influenced him to work to prevent another major war?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think he was a realist, and I'm not sure if he thought that a war could be prevented. He certainly wanted to see Turkey become a republic. That might come closest to what you are talking about, Mary, because he was very anti-Bolshevik. He was kind of like Herbert Hoover. He could sympathize with the peasants. And he had a keen memory when he was in the Balkans north of Salonika driving ambulances of hearing one Russian soldier sobbing that he wasn't home. I think Imbrie, with many, many other people, knew there was going to be another war. And that's one reason I showed you that map with Russia and Britain vying to get that oil. The U.S. provided 80% of the oil to the Allies during World War I. And at the end of the war, people knew if there were another war, and there surely would be, they couldn't rely on the U.S. reserves. They had to find their own. So see, in the 20s, people are already thinking about the next war. And so when he does, I think he realizes what's happening in Russia. The U.S. doesn't even have a diplomatic connection with this Soviet Republic until 1933. He goes to Turkey, and as you are probably aware of, there was this horrendous genocide of the Armenian people. And Turkey and Turks were cast as barbaric. And I think he really worked to say, yes, the genocide occurred. I mean, I track him crossing Anatolia. He's hitting every major spot where there was a slaughter on a massacre. He doesn't write about that for his article in the National Geographic, but you can read between the lines. Why is he here, there, and everywhere? However, the best way to see that this does not occur again is to try to erase that image of the barbaric, bloodthirsty Turk with his saber swords and recast Turkey as a modern republic. And that will help bring peace. So I think he sees the possibility of peace in certain places. As far as the World War, Mussolini is already in position when Imbrie is in Turkey. So I hope that answers, Mary.
All right, it looks like we are at 1:01 p.m., but I think I'll ask one more question out of respect for everybody's time, and then we can wrap up. So the last question is from Diana Dunning, who wants to know simply, why do you think nothing had been written on Imbrie previous to your book?
Oh, thank you. I guess there might be a couple of things. One, it was 1924. There was a lot going on. Persia was not at the top of the list at the State Department. The concerns were in Germany and what was happening there. Of course, in Russia, in England, which was suffering terribly after the war. So even though it was in the newspaper a lot for weeks and even months, then it faded. And I think we all know how that happens. We have a big story for a day, and then that big story goes away. And maybe 6 months down the line, you say, what happened? You know, where was that? And I had talked recently to a retired Department of State official, and he said he had actually not looked particularly at every story, but at all of the stories of all of these people who have lost their lives in service to the State Department. You know, they walk by the plaque every day with these names on them. Now there's multiple plaques, unfortunately. And he was thinking of like an anthology, which I think is a great idea, to remember who these people were. I mean, some of them died in the shipwreck on the way to their first post. You know, some died of cholera. Some were stabbed in a robbery attempt that had nothing to do with their being an official of the government. It is interesting that there wasn't attention paid to Imbrie, though, to me. And I think it maybe was just the times, and then his story was lost. And there's also, he had no descendants. His wife was pregnant when he was killed. She had a miscarriage about a week later, I think, from the trauma. She never remarried. There's no direct descendants. So there was nobody out there to say, here's my story. And he had been orphaned when he was in his teens. And so he didn't have parents either to carry on his legacy. So that could well have been part of it also. Nobody to champion him.
All right, well, I want to say for me and for a lot of the people who have been expressing their appreciation in the chat, thank you so much, Sue, for spending this hour with us and for sharing your wealth of knowledge about this subject. It's been a really fascinating hour, and hopefully people will look into your book and hopefully buy it. Again, that was called On Distant Service by Susan Stein. And we will see you all at the next event, whatever that is that you all choose to attend. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. And I am just so proud of Omaha and Tri-Faith. You just cannot know how happy I am that you are here. Thank you.
Thank you.